Clara Whitfield had $7, 2 cords of wood, and a winter that demanded 7. On January 9, 1887, the temperature in central Montana Territory dropped to 46 below zero in 16 hours. But 5 months before that night, Clara had never insulated a wall in her life. This is not a story about luck. Luck is what people call it when they cannot explain how someone survived what should have killed them. This is a story about wool, about a woman who listened to her grandmother when no one else would, about the winter that broke the cattle empire of the Northern Plains and the 12 by 14 cabin that refused to break with it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before the cold came, before the wool, before the night, a dying man fell through her door. There was summer, and in that summer, a train. The Northern Pacific deposited Clara at the end of its line in the Montana Territory in August of 1886. She was 23 years old, unmarried, the fourth of 9 children from a tenant farm outside Trondheim, Norway. She carried $7 sewn into the hem of her dress and a letter of employment from Helen Mercer, wife of the sheep rancher Robert Mercer, whose operation sprawled across the hills near White Sulphur Springs. From the rail station, she traveled by wagon across 70 miles of grassland, so flat and so treeless that she could see the Judith Mountains for 3 full days before reaching them. The driver spoke little, the mule spoke less, and Clara sat on the bench seat watching that mountain range grow from a smudge on the horizon to a wall of dark pine and gray rock, and she understood something that the brochures back in Trondheim had not mentioned. This land was not empty because no one wanted it. It was empty because it was trying to kill everyone who did. She had not come to Montana for adventure. She had not come chasing the American dream or the promise of gold or the romance of the frontier. She had come because the arithmetic of her family no longer worked. 11 people on a piece of rented ground that could feed 5. The winter of 1885 had killed their last 2 cows, and after that her father had simply stopped. Not collapsed, not wept. He just sat down one morning at the kitchen table and did not get up with any purpose again. Day after day he sat by the window looking out at the frozen field where nothing grew and nothing would grow, drinking thin coffee and waiting for something Clara knew would never arrive. She watched him for 3 months, and on the day she left for America, she made herself a promise, so quiet she never spoke it aloud. She would not become a person who waited. Whatever came, she would act. Even if the action was wrong, even if it killed her, anything was better than the chair by the window and the empty field. The Mercer Ranch needed herders. Helen had recruited young Norwegians from the old country, promising wages of $18 a month, plus room and board. Clara spoke passable English. She knew sheep. She had nothing to return to. These 3 facts were her entire resume, and Helen Mercer accepted them without sentiment. Clara's assignment was a line camp on the Musselshell River 12 miles from the main ranch. The shelter was a board and batten shack 12 feet by 14 feet, with walls made of single-thickness pine planks, nailed vertically and covered at the seams with thin wooden strips called battens. The gaps between the boards had been stuffed with newspaper that had long since turned to brown pulp and pulled away from the joints like dead skin. She stood in the doorway on her first afternoon and felt the August breeze pass through the walls as if they were not there. Not around them, not over them, through them. She could count 7 places where daylight showed between the planks. The floor was packed dirt. The roof was tar paper over rough lumber, and it leaked in 3 places that she could see and probably more that she could not. In the corner sat a cast iron stove with a crack running along one leg. It had been left by the previous occupant, a man named Daniel Yates, 26 years old, from Wisconsin. Clara did not know his name yet when she first touched that stove, running her fingers along the crack, feeling how the iron had split under some stress she could only imagine. But she would learn it soon enough, and when she did, the stove would never feel the same beneath her hand. The flock was 240 head. She would tend them through the summer, grazing through fall and through winter. The Mercers would send supplies once a month until the snow grew too deep for the wagon. After that, she would be alone until spring. On her 3rd day, Clara rode the 12 miles to the Mercer Ranch to collect her first supplies. Robert Mercer was away on business, but Helen walked her through the storeroom with the efficiency of a woman who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of beans, 5 pounds of coffee, salt, sugar, And the stove. Clara asked about firewood. How much would she need for the winter? Helen paused. It was a small pause, barely a breath, but Clara noticed it the way you notice a crack in ice before it spreads. A quarter cord a week once the real cold sets in, Helen said. Clara looked at the treeless hills rolling toward the horizon in every direction. Where do I get it? You cut it or you buy it in town, Helen said. Then perhaps reading something in Clara's face that she had seen before in other faces, she added Walter Haynes at the mercantile sells cordwood. $2.50 a cord. He delivers if you pay extra. $2.50 a cord, 7 cords for the winter. $17.50 plus delivery. Clara had $7 and would not see wages until October. She asked about Daniel Yates, the previous herder, the man who had left the cracked stove behind. Helen's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a door closing on a room she did not care to enter. He did not get enough wood, Helen said. November came fast. Robert found him in February. She let the silence carry the rest of the sentence. And Clara understood that Daniel Yates had not left the stove behind because he moved on to better work. He had left it because he was dead, frozen in this cabin, in the place where she now stood, on the dirt floor where she would sleep tonight. And the stove he had used to hold back the cold sat cracked in the corner like a headstone no one had bothered to remove. The town of White Sulphur Springs lay 8 miles southwest of Clara's camp. She rode there on her 4th day leading the pack mule Helen had lent her to see about wood and supplies and the true shape of her situation. The mercantile was a low wooden building with a false front that made it look taller than it was, a common trick on the frontier where appearance was often the only currency more abundant than debt. Inside the shelves held canned goods tools, bolts of fabric, coils of rope. The air smelled of coffee and kerosene and leather. The smell of every general store in every small town across the West, a smell that meant civilization and also meant price tags. Walter Haynes stood behind the counter. He was perhaps 50 years old with a gray beard trimmed close to his jaw and spectacles pushed up on his forehead, where they lived more often than on his nose. He had been in Montana Territory for 18 years, long enough to have buried more customers than he had made rich, and his eyes carried the particular steadiness of a man who had learned to assess credit risk, the way a doctor assesses a wound quickly, accurately, and without letting the diagnosis show on his face until he was ready. He watched Clara approach. "You are the Norwegian girl the Mercers hired," he said. It was not a question. Clara Whitfield. Walter Haynes. He did not offer his hand. "What do you need?" "Firewood. 7 cords." His eyebrows rose just slightly, the only surprise he would show. 7 cords. That is $17.50 plus $2 delivery, $19.50 total. He waited. When Clara said nothing, he continued. "How much have you got?" $7. "I will have wages in October. October is 2 months out. Winter is 4 months out. You planning to burn your wages before you earn them?" Clara felt heat rise in her face, and she hated it. Hated that this man behind his counter could make her feel small, with nothing but arithmetic and patience. "I can pay for 2 cords now," she said. "The rest when I have sheep money." Walter shook his head. "Wool prices are down. The Mercers are stretched thin. Half the outfits in Mayhew County are running on credit I will never see again." He leaned forward on the counter, and his voice dropped into the register menus when they believe they are delivering truth. "You know what the problem is with you sheep people? You think the land owes you something. Cattle ranchers understand you have to put money in before you take money out. Sheep people show up with nothing, expect to scrape by on nothing, and then act surprised when nothing is exactly what they get." He straightened up. "I will sell you 2 cords for $5. That is all the credit I can extend. You want more, you find another way." 2 cords. Clara did the math while Walter watched her do it. A quarter cord a week. 2 cords would last 8 weeks. Winter began in late November and did not break until March. 4 months. 16 weeks minimum. She was short by 10 weeks, by 2.5 cords, by the distance between alive and dead. "What about insulation?" she asked. "Something for the walls." Walter almost smiled. It was not a warm expression. "Tar paper is $2 a roll," he said. "You will need 4 rolls minimum. Canvas is cheaper, 80 cents a yard. Most folks who cannot afford proper lumber just stuff newspaper in the gaps and pray." I have seen the newspaper in my cabin, Clara said. It does not work. No, it does not. But it is free, and free is what most people in your situation can afford. He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw something she could not quite name. It might have been pity. It might have been contempt. It might have been the thing that lives between the two. The exhaustion of a man who has watched this scene play out too many times with too many young faces to count. You want my advice, Walter said. Find a husband. Find a family to winter with. That cabin you are in is a shell. One bad storm, and the wind will push right through those walls like they are not there. 2 cords of wood, no insulation, alone out there. He shook his head slowly. I have seen the Mercer herders come and go. The ones who make it have help. The ones who do not. He did not finish the sentence. His eyes shifted just for a fraction of a second to a point somewhere past Clara's shoulder, past the shelves, past the wall itself. Then he was back steady and still behind his counter, as if the moment had not happened. But Clara saw it, a flicker of something private and wounded gone before she could understand it. She bought the 2 cords. She had $2 left. The delivery would come in 3 days. She rode back to her cabin with the math repeating in her head, like a verdict read aloud in a language she could not argue with. 8 weeks of fuel, 16 weeks of winter, 10 weeks short, walls that let the wind through, a cracked stove, 240 sheep to keep alive. And Walter Haynes's voice as certain as gravity, the ones who do not. What Clara did not know, riding home through the August heat with the grasshoppers jumping from the path of her horse, was that winter would not wait 16 weeks. It was coming in 10. September brought the first cold nights. Clara woke to frost on the inside of her window, and when she breathed, her breath hung in the air like something solid, like the ghost of every word she had not spoken since arriving in this place where there was no one to speak to. The newspaper stuffing had compressed and pulled away from the gaps, and she could see daylight through the walls in 7 places, 7 small windows, into a world that was already turning against her. She had spent the month walking her flock across the hills north of the Musselshell, watching them fatten on the last summer grass. The ewes were healthy, the lambs were growing, the wool on their backs was thick and greasy, matted with lanolin and dust and burrs, and when she sheared the spring lambs for their first cut, the fleece came off in heavy oily sheets that stank of animal and earth, and something older than both. It was the smell that saved her, or rather, it was the smell that unlocked the memory that saved her. She was sitting in her cabin on a September evening, wrapped in her coat because the stove could not heat the space faster than the walls bled warmth into the night, and she was looking at the pile of damaged fleece in the corner. Belly wool, tags, pieces too dirty or too matted for the Mercers to sell. Helen had told her to burn it or bury it. The merchants in town would not touch it. It was waste. It was nothing. The smell filled the cabin, greasy, thick, the smell of lanolin. And in that smell, Clara was 8 years old again, sitting in her grandmother's farmhouse outside Trondheim. The stone walls had been lined with felt and layers of raw wool pressed into every gap where cold crept through. Her grandmother had knelt beside her and explained it in the simple way she explained everything, as if the world's secrets were obvious to anyone who bothered to pay attention. The grease in unwashed wool keeps out the damp child. The crimped fibers trap air like 1,000 tiny pockets. And air does not carry heat. That is why sheep survive the cold. They carry their own insulation on their backs. The wool is not just warm, it is waterproof. Clara had been 8. She had not fully understood. But the memory had lodged itself somewhere below conscious thought, in the place where the body stores the things the mind forgets, waiting for the moment when it would matter more than anything else she had ever learned. She stood up. She walked to the pile of waste fleece. She picked up a handful and pressed it against the wall, into one of the gaps where daylight showed through. The wind stopped. She held it there, feeling the draft die against her palm, feeling the cold recede like a tide pulling back from shore. Then she pulled the fleece away and looked at the gap. The fibers had compressed into the space, filling it completely, and when she released them, they sprang back slightly, holding their shape. She looked at the pile. 40 pounds of damaged fleece, maybe more. She looked at the walls. 334 square feet of surface after accounting for the door and the single window. Could she line the entire interior with wool? The idea was absurd. No one in Montana insulated buildings with raw fleece. You could not sell it. You could not use it. You burned it or buried it. That was what the merchant said. That was what everyone did. But Clara's grandmother had lined walls with wool in Norway. The Sami people stuffed reindeer hides into their shelters. Mongolian herders wrapped their gers in layers of felt so thick they survived winters colder than anything Montana had ever produced. 3,000 years of evidence, ignored by a territory that preferred to burn wood it could not afford and freeze in cabins it could not insulate. Maybe everyone in Montana was wrong. James Caldwell ran sheep on the range east of Clara's camp. He was Norwegian too, from Bergen, a man of about 35 who had been in Montana for 6 years and spoke English with an accent as thick as Clara's own. He stopped by her cabin in late September to check on the new herder and found her nailing fleece to the interior walls with a hammer and a mouthful of nails. He stood in the doorway and watched. She had stripped to her shirt sleeves despite the cold, and her hands were black with lanolin. The smell in the cabin was overpowering: animal grease and unwashed wool, and something almost chemical, sharp and dense. "What are you doing?" James said. "Lining the walls. The lanolin repels moisture. The crimp traps air. Air does not conduct heat. The cold cannot get through." James stepped inside. He touched the wall where she had already finished a section, running his fingers over the compressed fleece. It was dense and springy, and his fingers came away greasy. "This will draw vermin," he said. "Mice, moths, everything that eats wool. The lanolin repels them too. Insects do not like the taste. You do not know that. I know my grandmother lined her walls this way. I know Mongolian herders have used felt insulation for 3,000 years. I know that the newspaper in these gaps does nothing, and the wood I can afford will last 8 weeks, and winter is 4 months long." James was quiet. He had his own history with bold ideas in Montana. His first winter 6 years ago, he had spent 2 months digging an underground shelter for his sheep, convinced that the earth itself would provide warmth. When winter came, groundwater flooded the shelter, the walls collapsed, and he lost 60 animals in a single night. He had nearly died himself, pinned under a timber in freezing mud, saved only because a neighbor happened to ride past and heard him shouting. Since then, James Caldwell did not trust innovation. He trusted firewood in thick walls and the hard lessons that 6 Montana winters had carved into his bones. "Clara," he said, "I have seen cabins fail. I have seen herders freeze. This is not Norway. When January comes, when the temperature drops to 40 below, your stove will run all day and the ice will still form on your water bucket. Wool cannot stop that kind of cold. It can slow it down, not enough. You should be cutting wood. You should be finding a family to winter with. You should be what?" Clara turned to face him, hammer in hand. "Finding a husband, giving up my flock, going back to Norway and admitting I failed." She shook her head. "I have 240 sheep. I have this cabin. I have 2 cords of wood and 40 pounds of fleece. I am going to line these walls and burn my wood slowly and survive the winter. If I am wrong, I will be dead and it will not matter. If I am right." She did not finish. She did not need to. James stood there looking at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I hope you are right," he said. "I will check on you in November. If you are still alive, maybe I will ask you how it is done." He left. Clara turned back to the wall and drove another nail. The calendar said September 27th. The first hard freeze was 3 weeks away. By the second week of October, word had reached the cattle ranchers. Clara had kept to herself through the fall, walking her flock by day and working on her cabin walls each evening, but in a territory where gossip traveled faster than weather, her project had not gone unnoticed. She rode to White Sulphur Springs on October 15th to buy additional waste fleece from the Mercers 40 cents, for 20 pounds, the going rate for material destined for the burn pile. She could barely afford it. But when she rode through town, Garrett Dunning was waiting outside the mercantile. Dunning ran cattle south of the Judith Mountains. 3,000 head, a crew of 12. He had built his operation from nothing over 15 years, and he considered every acre of grazing land in Major County to be his by right of sweat and investment. Sheep, in his view, destroyed that land. Sheep stank. Sheep drew wolves. And the people who herded sheep were worse than the animals themselves, foreign poor, stubborn, and too ignorant to understand that they were not wanted. He leaned against the hitching post as Clara dismounted, watching her with eyes that did not blink. "You are the Norwegian," he said, "the one stuffing her cabin with sheep dung." Clara tied her horse. "Fleece," she said. "Not dung, same thing." Dunning pushed off the post and stepped closer. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a face carved by decades of wind and a voice that carried across the street without effort. People were stopping to watch. "I hear you are buying up waste wool, planning to sell it to someone even more foolish than you, planning to use it for insulation." Dunning smiled. It held no warmth. "You know what happens when a sheep operation fails out here? The land recovers. The grass comes back. The range opens for cattle." He stepped closer still. "You know what I think? I think you are going to freeze to death in that shack of yours. And when spring comes, there will be 200 dead sheep rotting on the Muscle Range, and the Mercers will finally learn what the rest of us already know. This is not sheep country. Never was. Never will be." Clara felt the eyes of the town on her, felt the weight of Dunning's certainty pressing against her chest, and beneath it something colder than his contempt, the quiet knowledge that he might be right. "I will see you in spring," she said. Dunning laughed. "No, you will not." He walked away. Clara went into the mercantile. Walter Haynes was behind the counter, and he had heard every word through the open door. "He is not wrong," Walter said quietly, "about the cold." Clara collected her supplies and did not answer. By late October, the walls were finished. Every interior surface of the cabin, 334 square feet of planks in gaps and seams, was covered in a layer of compressed raw fleece, 3.5 inches thick. She had used 63 pounds of wool nailed and stuffed and packed into every crevice her fingers could reach. The lanolin smell had faded somewhat as it oxidized in the air, but the cabin still carried the thick animal scent of a shearing barn in summer. She had also lined the ceiling another 40 square feet, another 12 pounds of fleece. The roof still leaked in 3 places, but now the leaks dripped onto wool that absorbed the moisture and held it without passing it further. Outside, 2 cords of wood stood stacked against the north wall. Inside, she had flour beans, coffee salt. She had 238 sheep, having lost 2 to wolves in late September. And she had doubts. At night, when the October wind tested every seam in her wool-covered walls and the temperature dropped to 20 degrees, the voices came back. James Caldwell, cautious and certain. "Wool cannot stop that kind of cold." Walter Haynes steady behind his counter. "The ones who do not." Garrett Dunning smiling without warmth. "No, you will not." She had gambled everything on the memory of an old woman in Norway and 63 pounds of material that the entire territory considered garbage. If she was wrong, she would die alone in a cabin that smelled like sheep, and the coyotes would find her before the spring thaw, and Walter Haynes would add her name to the long list of names he carried behind his eyes, and no one would remember Clara Whitfield except as another Norwegian who did not make it. The first snow fell on November 4th, 1886. And in her cabin on the Muscle River, wrapped in wool that no one believed in, Clara Whitfield was about to learn whether her grandmother had been right or whether all of Montana had been right instead. What she did not know, what no one knew, was that this winter would not be like the winters before it. It would kill cattle by the thousands. It would bankrupt ranches that had stood for a decade. It would freeze rivers solid and bury towns to their rooftops and earn a name that would live in the history books long after everyone who suffered through it was gone. They would call it the Great Die-Up, and it was 3 weeks away. The snow did not ask permission. It came on November 4th, and it did not leave. 2 inches became 4. 4 became 8. 8 became a foot, and then the wind rearranged it into drifts that piled against the cabin walls like something trying to bury her while she was still breathing. The temperature dropped. 10 above 0, then 5, then 0, then 5 below. Clara fed her stove the way you feed a sick animal, carefully measuring each piece, calculating how long the heat would hold before the walls demanded more. 2 cords of wood, a quarter cord per week, was what Helen Mercer had estimated. 8 weeks of fuel against 16 weeks of winter. The arithmetic had not changed since August. It sat in the back of her mind like a stone she could not swallow. But something else was changing, something the arithmetic had not predicted. The cabin was warm, not hot, not comfortable. Warm was perhaps too generous a word for what she felt. But at 5 below 0 outside, with the stove burning low to stretch the wood as far as it would go, the interior temperature held steady at 38 degrees. 38 degrees was not a temperature anyone would choose. It was the temperature of a root cellar in October, the temperature of a church basement where the furnace has not been lit. But 38 degrees was also the temperature at which water remained liquid and blood continued to flow, and a woman wrapped in 2 blankets could sleep through the night without waking to find frost on her eyelashes. The walls were not bleeding heat anymore. Clara pressed her palm against the interior surface on the morning of November 12th, when the thermometer outside read 7 below. The wool was cool to the touch but not cold. Not the ice sheet surface she had felt in September, when the bare planks might as well have been open windows. The fleece had created something between her and the killing air, outside a barrier that the wind could press against, but not pass through. 3.5 inches of compressed fiber, greasy with lanolin, matted and dense, doing what her grandmother had promised it would do 60 years ago in a farmhouse on the other side of the world. She did not celebrate. It was too early for that, and Clara was not a woman built for celebration. She was built for measurement. So she measured. She learned to read the walls the way a sailor reads water. She pressed her hand against different sections at different hours, noting where the cold penetrated deepest and where it was held at bay. The south wall, catching what thin warmth the low winter sun could offer, stayed warmer than the north wall, which took the full force of the wind. She moved her sleeping pallet to the south corner. She hung a wool blanket across the north wall as a second layer, creating a gap of still air between the blanket and the fleece that added another degree or two of insulation. And she discovered something that changed her math. She was burning less wood than Helen Mercer had predicted. Not a quarter cord per week, but a fifth. The wool was doing what firewood alone could not. It was holding the heat inside the cabin long enough for each piece of wood to matter more. At a fifth of a cord per week, her 2 cords would last 10 weeks instead of 8. Still short, still not enough. But the gap between what she had and what she needed was closing. And for the first time since she had ridden into this valley in August, the distance between alive and dead felt like something a person might cross. By November 20th, the drifts had climbed to 4 feet against the cabin walls. Clara dug a path to the woodpile each morning, a trench through white that filled itself overnight and had to be dug again. She dug another path to the small barn where she sheltered her sheep at night, a structure even more fragile than her cabin, built of scrap lumber and hope. The sheep pressed together inside it, their combined body heat and the thick wool on their backs doing for them what Clara's walls were doing for her. She had settled into a rhythm that stripped everything unnecessary from her days. Wake before dawn, feed the stove, break ice from the water bucket if it had formed overnight, check the sheep, melt snow for water, eat, check the sheep again, stuff any gap in the walls where she felt a new draft, eat again, feed the stove, sleep. The rhythm was not comfortable, but it was sustainable, and sustainability was the only thing that mattered now. Then the first real storm came, and sustainability stopped being enough. November 22nd. The temperature dropped from 15 above to 11 below in 6 hours. Not a gradual descent, but a plunge, as if the air itself had fallen off a cliff. The wind came behind it, screaming across the Musselshell Valley at 40 miles per hour, driving snow, not downward, but sideways, horizontal sheets of white that struck the cabin walls with a sound like sand thrown against glass. Clara sealed her door with rags and every spare piece of cloth she owned. She sat in the center of her cabin, wrapped in her coat and both blankets, and listened. The wind did not howl. That word was too gentle for what she heard. The wind shrieked. It hammered. It found the corners of the cabin and tried to peel them apart. The walls creaked and groaned like the hull of a ship in heavy seas, and Clara could feel the entire structure shudder on its foundation with each gust. But the wool held. She pressed her palm against the north wall, the wall taking the worst of it, and felt the cold pressing from the other side like a living weight, something with intention, something that wanted in. The fleece compressed slightly under the pressure, then held. The temperature inside the cabin dropped to 31 degrees. Her water bucket did not freeze. 31 degrees inside at 11 below outside. A difference of 42 degrees held by 3.5 inches of waste wool that everyone in Meagher County had told her to burn. The blizzard lasted 2 days. When it passed, Clara dug herself out and checked her sheep. She had lost none. The barn had held. The woodpile was shorter by the amount she had expected, perhaps a fraction more. The math was still working, but the blizzard was only the opening act. She learned this on December 1st when James Caldwell dug his way to her cabin to make sure she had not become another Daniel Yates. He stood in her doorway, stamping snow from his boots, his face raw and red and chapped from the wind in the way that faces become when they have been exposed to cold for too long and too often. He had lost 5 sheep in the November storm, frozen where they stood in the open because they could not find the barn in the whiteout. 5 animals locked in place by the cold, their wool crusted with ice, their eyes open and unseeing. He had found them 2 days after the storm, standing in a row like monuments to something no one would want to remember. "This is not the worst," James said. He was not looking at Clara when he said it. He was looking at the walls, at the wool insulation, running his eyes over the surface the way a man examines a levee when he knows the river is rising. The real storms come in January. The temperature will drop to 40 below, maybe colder. "It is working," Clara said. She meant the wool, she meant the cabin, she meant everything. James met her eyes. "So far," he said, and there was nothing in his voice that sounded like agreement. Then he said what she had already been thinking, but had not permitted herself to speak aloud. "The old-timers are saying this winter is different. Harder. Earlier. The cattle are already dying on the range because the grass is locked under ice. If the sheep start dying too." He did not need to finish. Clara understood. If the winter killed her flock, it would not matter how warm her cabin stayed. She would have survived the cold only to face something worse than freezing. She would be alive with no income, no flock, no future, and no reason to remain in a territory that had taken everything from her except her heartbeat. The wool insulation might save her life, only to leave her with nothing to live for. "I will keep them alive," Clara said. She said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that has not yet been proven, but that you have decided to treat as true because the alternative is unacceptable. James nodded. Then he paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame, and delivered the news she had been expecting, but hoping would not come. "The Mercer sent word," he said. "They cannot get supplies through until spring. The snow is too deep for the wagon. You are on your own until March." He pulled his collar up against the cold, looked at her one more time, then walked out into the white, and the white swallowed him within 30 yards, and Clara was alone again. She closed the door and leaned her back against it. Outside, the wind was building towards something she could feel in her teeth. The calendar on the wall said December 1st. Winter had 3 months left to run, and the worst, as James had promised, was still gathering its strength somewhere to the northwest patient, an enormous waiting for January. December ground forward in a blur of white and wind and routine. Clara fell deeper into her rhythm, and the rhythm became her entire world. Wake, stove, sheep, water, eat, sleep. The words of the days fell away because there was no one to speak them to. Monday was the same as Thursday. Christmas was the same as any other Tuesday. The only calendar that mattered was the woodpile against the north wall, shrinking at its steady pace, a fifth of a cord each week, exactly as she had measured. She began talking to the sheep, not because she believed they understood, but because the sound of her own voice had become strange to her, a foreign thing that startled her when it broke the silence. She named the lead ewe Margaret after her oldest sister in Norway, and she talked to Margaret about the weather and the woodpile, and the way the light looked at 4 in the afternoon when the sun was already gone and the sky turned a color that was not quite blue and not quite gray, but something between the two that she had never seen before in Montana and would never see anywhere else. She talked to the stove. "Good morning," she would say, feeding it the first wood of the day. "Thank you," she would say when the heat reached her face. She understood that she was performing small acts of madness, but she also understood that small acts of madness were the price of solitude, and solitude was the price of survival, and survival was the price of everything she was trying to build. The loneliness did not arrive like a blow. It arrived like water rising in a room with no drain. Slowly, steadily. Until one afternoon in mid-December, she realized she had been speaking aloud for 20 minutes, to no one, narrating her own actions as she melted snow for water, and she could not remember when she had started. By Christmas, she had burned just over 1 cord. 1 cord remained. 7 weeks of fuel, 9 weeks of winter left. The math was still against her, but it was closer now, close enough to see the other side. On New Year's Day, 1887, the temperature dropped to 22 below zero. Clara woke to a cabin that was 34 degrees inside. Her water bucket had a skim of ice on top, thin enough to break with her finger. She built up the fire, and within an hour, the interior climbed to 41. The wool was still holding, but 22 below was not the test. James had told her what was coming. 40 below, maybe colder. a temperature she had never experienced. A temperature she had only read about in Norwegian accounts of Arctic expeditions, where they described the cold as something that stopped being weather and became predator. At 40 below, exposed skin froze in minutes, metal burned to the touch, breath crystallized in the air and fell as tiny ice particles before it could dissipate, as if the air itself was refusing to carry anything that came from a living body. Clara prepared. She restacked her remaining wood for better airflow. She checked every seam in the wool insulation, pressing additional fleece into any gap her fingers could find. She stuffed rags around the door frame so tight that the door barely closed. She hung her heaviest blanket over the window, sealing the last point of weakness. And she waited. The storm arrived on January 8, 1887. It came from the northwest, a wall of gray cloud that swallowed the Judith Mountains by mid-morning and reached Clara's cabin by noon. The wind arrived first, a steady building pressure that made the roof groan and the door rattle in its frame, and then the snow came behind it, not falling from the sky, but driving across the land in horizontal sheets that erased the world beyond arm's length. Clara had brought her sheep into the barn the night before, packing all 236 surviving animals into a space built for perhaps 100. They pressed against each other, their bodies generating heat, their wool holding it. She had lined that barn too in late November, with the last of her waste fleece. The walls were not as thick as her cabin's, barely 2 inches, but it was something. It was everything she had left to give. By nightfall on January 8th, the temperature was 18 below. By midnight, it was 31 below. Clara fed her stove, steadily burning more wood than she wanted to, watching the interior hold at 28 degrees. 28, below freezing, but not frozen. She slept in her coat and every blanket she owned, waking every 2 hours to feed the fire each time, checking the thermometer on the north wall before adding wood each time, doing the math in her head. Wood against cold, fuel against time, the equation that had governed her life since August. Dawn on January 9th brought no light, only a pale gray glow behind the driving snow that said the sun existed somewhere above the storm, but wanted nothing to do with the world below it. The wind had not stopped. If anything, it had strengthened, gusting to speeds that made the cabin shudder the way a living thing shudders when it is afraid. Clara checked her thermometer. 24 degrees inside. She went to the door, pressed her hand against the frame, felt the cold radiating through the wood like heat from a forge, but reversed the opposite of warmth, the negative image of everything that kept a body alive. She cracked the door open 1 inch to check conditions outside. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow drove into her face, stinging her eyes shut instantly. She slammed the door, gasping, brushing ice crystals from her hair, with hands that had gone numb in the 2 seconds they were exposed. She had felt cold like that only once before as a child in Norway during a storm that killed 4 people in her village. That storm had been 30 below. This was worse. She did not open the door again for 3 days. The crisis came on the evening of January 9th, and it did not come from the cold. Clara was rationing her wood, carefully feeding the stove, just enough to maintain 22 degrees inside. The temperature outside had dropped below the range of her thermometer, the small mercury instrument she had purchased from Walter Haynes in October and mounted on the north wall. The mercury had retreated into the bulb and refused to rise, which meant the temperature was below the lowest mark on the scale. She would learn later that White Sulphur Springs recorded 46 below zero that night. Miles City, 200 miles to the east, recorded 60 below. She was conserving. She was managing. She was surviving. Then she heard the pounding on the door. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the voice of the wind, and she thought she had imagined it. A branch blown against the wall, a piece of roofing working loose. But it came again, louder, more desperate, a rhythm that could only be produced by human hands, because only human hands would be foolish enough or desperate enough to be outside on a night when the air itself was trying to kill everything it touched. Clara crossed to the door. She pressed her ear against the frame and shouted over the wind, "Who is there?" The voice that came back was barely audible, shredded by the gale into syllables she could not assemble. But she caught one word, the only word that mattered. Help. She pulled the door open. James Caldwell fell into her cabin. He was coated in snow so thick he looked like something carved from ice rather than born from flesh. His beard was frozen solid, a mask of white that made his face unrecognizable. His clothing was stiff, his coat rigid as plywood, his boots locked in the position of his last step. And his hands, when Clara grabbed them to pull him inside, were white and hard as wood. Not pale, not cold. White. The white of tissue that has lost its blood, the white that comes before the black, the white that means the body has already begun to sacrifice its edges to save its core. She slammed the door against the wind and dragged him to the stove. He was shaking so violently that his teeth made a sound like gravel in a tin can, and when he tried to speak, the words came out broken and confused, reassembled from some language that was neither English nor Norwegian, but the universal tongue of a body shutting down. Sheep, he managed, lost them. Barn collapsed. Had to walk. How far? Clara was already pulling off his frozen coat, working the buttons that had iced shut, peeling the layers away from his body the way you peel bark from a log. 6 miles, maybe 7. I do not. He trailed off his eyes, losing their hold on the room. 6 miles, in 46 below zero. In a blizzard with winds that would have driven the effective temperature down to something that had no business being measured because no living thing was supposed to experience it. Clara did not know how he was still breathing. She did not know if he would continue. She worked fast, and she worked with the knowledge that every action she took in the next hour would determine whether James Caldwell lived or died, and she could not afford to get any of it wrong. She wrapped his hands in raw fleece, the same waste wool that lined her walls, the same material everyone told her was garbage. She wrapped his feet the same way. She held them close to the stove, but not touching the iron, because she knew from Norway, from her grandmother, from the hard education of cold country people, that warming frozen flesh too fast against direct heat would destroy the tissue as surely as the cold itself. She boiled water and made him drink. Tiny sips at first because his throat was nearly frozen and his body could not process more. Then larger swallows as the shaking eased from violent to steady. She piled every blanket she owned on top of him and fed the stove until the cabin temperature climbed to 38, then 40, then 45 degrees. Her wood pile was shrinking faster than she could afford, and she knew it, and she did not stop. Because James Caldwell was dying in front of her. And Clara Whitfield understood something about herself in that moment that she had not understood before. She could watch her woodpile disappear. She could accept that saving this man might cost her the fuel she needed to save herself. She could do the math that said every log she burned tonight was a day less of warmth in February. But she could not sit in a warm cabin and listen to a man die on the other side of her wool-covered walls. That was not a calculation. That was a line she could not cross and still be the person she had decided to be on the day she left Norway. So she burned the wood, and she kept him alive. The night stretched long and dark and loud with wind. Clara sat beside James on the dirt floor, watching his breathing, checking his hands and feet every 30 minutes for the color that would tell her whether blood was returning. Pink meant life. Black meant death. And for hours, the color was neither just the terrible white of flesh suspended between the two, waiting to be claimed by one side or the other. Around midnight, his eyes cleared. He looked at Clara. Then he looked at the walls around him, the wool-covered walls that were holding 22 degrees of difference against the killing cold outside. His lips moved. "Your cabin," he said. His voice was barely there, a whisper scraped across gravel, but it was lucid. "It is warm." "The wool," Clara said. James stared at her. Then he laughed. It was a weak and broken sound that turned immediately into a cough, but it was a laugh, and it was the first laugh Clara had heard since September, and it sounded like something unlocking. "The wool," he repeated. "You were right. You walked 6 miles in 40 below. 46. Maybe colder." He closed his eyes. "My sheep are dead. All of them. The barn roof came down under the snow. I tried to dig them out, but—" He stopped. Clara did not make him continue. She asked about his hands and feet. Could he feel them? James flexed his fingers slowly. They were still pale, but not the dead white of before. Pink was creeping back into the skin, faint but real, the color of circulation fighting its way through damaged tissue. "Pain," he said. "Burning. That is good. Pain means they are alive." She fed the stove again. The wood pile was down to half a cord. 4 weeks of fuel at her normal rate. Maybe 2 weeks at the rate she was burning tonight. But James Caldwell was alive. And outside in the howling dark, the storm was still building towards something worse. James stayed in Clara's cabin for 5 days. The frostbite was severe. 3 fingers on his left hand would never fully recover their feeling or their strength. 2 toes on his right foot turned the black of dead tissue over those 5 days and would eventually require amputation by a doctor in White Sulphur Springs. But he lived. He lived because a woman who had $7 and no husband and no help had lined her walls with wool that everyone told her was worthless, and because when he fell through her door more dead than alive, she chose to burn her own survival to save his. Before he left, walking slowly and painfully through the snow toward Town Moan on the morning of January 14th, he stood in her doorway one last time and looked at the walls. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know it would work?" "I did not know," Clara said. "I hoped." James nodded slowly. Then he said, "I am going to rebuild my barn. This time I am going to line the walls with wool, if you will show me how." Clara walked him through it. The thickness required, the method of attachment, the importance of using unwashed fleece with the lanolin intact. James listened, asked questions, repeated the specifications back to her until he had them memorized the way a man memorizes directions to a place he cannot afford to miss. When he finally left, moving slowly across the white toward the first hill, Clara watched him until he disappeared. Then she turned back to her cabin and her sheep and her diminishing woodpile. 3/8 of a cord remained. 5 or 6 weeks of fuel if she was careful. Winter had 7 weeks left. The math was still against her. But the worst was over. She could feel it in the way the wind had eased, in the way the temperature had climbed from the depths of the bulb back to a number her thermometer could read. The worst had come, and she had held. She and her wool and her grandmother's memory had held. Except the worst was not over. Not quite. The second storm arrived on January 28th. It came without warning. The morning was clear, the sky a pale blue that felt almost like mercy after weeks of gray. By noon, the blue was gone, replaced by a ceiling of clouds so low and so dark it looked like the sky was being lowered onto the land by something enormous and deliberate. By evening, the cloud had opened, and the snow was falling so thick that Clara could not see the barn from her doorway 30 feet away. The temperature began to fall. 5 below at sunset, 10 below by 8, 20 below by 10, 30 below at midnight, and still falling. Clara fed her stove and watched her thermometer and felt something she had not felt since the January 9th storm. Something beyond cold, beyond winter, beyond anything she had a name for. This was the temperature at which the rules of survival changed, at which the margin between life and death narrowed to the width of a wall. By dawn on January 29th, ranch thermometers across Meagher County read 63 degrees below zero, 63 below. Clara had never conceived of such a number. The worst cold she had ever experienced before Montana was 30 below the Norwegian storm of her childhood that had killed 4 villagers and frozen the river solid enough to drive a wagon across. 63 below was 33 degrees colder than the worst night of her life until now. It was the temperature of high Arctic expeditions, of places where humans went only with extensive preparation and the full expectation that the cold was trying to kill them every second. The storm lasted 6 days. Clara stopped checking her woodpile. She burned what she had to burn, and she did not count. She kept her stove running every minute of every hour, feeding it on a cycle of 60 minutes that she maintained through sheer will, sleeping in 20-minute intervals between feedings, waking to the cold, pressing closer each time the fire ebbed. The interior temperature of her cabin dropped to 14 degrees, then 12, then 9 degrees above zero, 23 degrees below the freezing point of water. Cold enough that ice formed on her water bucket, thick enough now that she had to crack it with the back of her axe. Cold enough that her breath fogged so dense she could barely see across the room. Cold enough that she wore every piece of clothing she owned every hour of every day and still shivered. But 9 degrees above zero at 63 below zero, outside was not death. It was 72 degrees of difference held by 3.5 inches of raw sheep's wool nailed to pine planks by a woman with a hammer and a memory. It was the distance between miserable and dead, and miserable was something Clara could survive. She stuffed additional fleece into the gaps around the door and window. She hung wool blankets across the ceiling, creating a second barrier beneath the insulated roof. She did everything she could think of, and then she did the only thing left. She waited. Her sheep survived in their wool-lined barn, pressed together for warmth, eating the hay she had stockpiled in the fall. She lost 11 animals over those 6 days, the oldest ewes, the weakest lambs. But 225 survived. On the open range outside, cattle were dying by the thousands. Entire herds froze, standing up, their bodies locked in place by the cold, to be found months later when the snow melted, still upright, still facing into the wind, as if they had simply stopped walking, and the cold had preserved them in their final stride. The Judith Basin lost 60% of its cattle that winter. Ranches that had operated for a decade went bankrupt overnight. Men who had called themselves cattle kings found themselves paupers by spring. They would call it the Great Die-Up, the catastrophe that broke the open-range cattle industry and remade the economy of the northern Great Plains. But in a 12 by 14 cabin on the Musselshell River, lined with 63 pounds of raw sheep's wool, Clara Whitfield survived. The storm broke on February 3rd. The temperature climbed to 20 below, then 10 below, then 0, then 5 above. By February 10th, 15 degrees. Warm enough that Clara cracked her door open and felt the air on her face without pain for the first time in weeks. She had 1/8 of a cord of wood left, maybe 10 days of fuel at her survival rate. Winter had 5 weeks left to run. She had beaten the cold. She had beaten 63 below zero with wool and a cracked stove and 2 cords of wood when the experts said she needed 7. But the cold had taken nearly everything in return. And now, for the first time in 5 months, Clara Whitfield had to leave her cabin and face the world outside her walls. A world that, as she would soon discover, had changed completely while she was inside, holding the line between 9 degrees and death. She began walking on the morning of February 12th. The snow was waist-deep in the open stretches and deeper in the draws where the wind had packed it into drifts that reached above her head. The sky was clear for the first time in what felt like months, a pale winter blue, so sharp and clean it almost hurt to look at, and the sun sat low on the southern horizon, throwing long shadows across a landscape that bore no resemblance to the one Clara had ridden through in August. Everything was white. The hills were white. The river was white, frozen solid beneath a blanket of snow, so thick that Clara could not tell where the bank ended and the ice began. The trees along the drainage, the few cottonwoods and willows that had survived decades of wind and drought, stood bare and black against the white like cracks in a sheet of paper. There were no tracks, no birds, no movement of any kind except her own legs pushing through the snow one step at a time, each step requiring the kind of effort that in summer would have carried her 10 yards but now carried her 8 miles to White Sulphur Springs. She had walked it before in autumn when the ground was firm and the grass was brown, and the distance was nothing more than a pleasant ride on a borrowed horse. Now the distance was a negotiation with snow and cold, and a body that had spent 3 months burning more energy than it consumed. She was thinner than she had been in August. Her clothes hung loose. Her boots, the same boots she had brought from Norway, were cracked along the soles from the dry cold, and she could feel the snow seeping through with each step. But she walked, because the alternative was to sit in her cabin with 1/8 of a cord of wood and wait for the math to finish what the cold had started. And Clara Whitfield did not wait. That was the promise she had made to herself the day she watched her father sit down at the kitchen table in Norway and stop being a man who acted. She would not sit. She would not wait. She would walk 8 miles through waist-deep snow at 8 below zero, because walking was doing, and doing was living, and living was the only option she had ever been willing to accept. She reached White Sulphur Springs by early afternoon. Her legs ached from the hip sockets down, and her face was burned raw by the wind that had picked up during the last 2 miles. But she was upright and moving, and that was enough. The town she walked into was not the town she had last seen in October. In October, White Sulphur Springs had been a frontier settlement in the last good days of autumn, busy with the work of preparing for winter, noisy with the sound of wagons and horses, and men arguing about cattle prices in front of the saloon. The mercantile had been full. The hotel had been full. The livery stable had been turning away horses because every stall was occupied. Now the streets were nearly empty. The snow had been cleared from the main road in a narrow trench just wide enough for a single wagon, and the banks on either side rose above Clara's head. The buildings looked smaller, somehow diminished by the drifts that pressed against their walls and climbed toward their windows. The hotel porch, where cattlemen had sat in rocking chairs, smoking cigars and discussing the price of beef, with the comfortable certainty of men who owned the world they surveyed, was buried under 4 feet of snow. No one had bothered to dig it out. Clara walked past the hotel and saw a man sitting on the steps that someone had partially cleared, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the street with the particular emptiness of a person who has stopped expecting anything from the view in front of him. She did not know him. She did not need to. His face told a story that every face in White Sulphur Springs was telling that February. The great die-up had come through this town like a scythe through standing wheat, and what it left behind was thinner and quieter and less certain of everything. She walked past the livery stable where half the stalls stood empty because the horses that had occupied them were dead or sold. Past the bank where she had no account, but where men who did have accounts were discovering that the numbers written in their ledgers no longer corresponded to anything real. The cattle that had backed their loans were frozen on the range. The grass that had fed the cattle was locked beneath ice. The system that had turned grass into beef, into money, into empire, had broken at its foundation, and the men who had built their lives on that system were now learning what Clara had known since August. When the math does not work, no amount of confidence can make it work. She stopped outside Walter Haynes's mercantile. The false front still made the building look taller than it was, but the paint was peeling worse than she remembered, and the sign above the door had developed a crack that ran diagonally from corner to corner, splitting the name Haynes in two. She pushed through the door. Inside, the store was crowded. A dozen people filled the aisles, moving between the shelves with the slow, deliberate pace of people who were calculating the cost of every item before they touched it. They were gaunt, all of them, in the way that February made frontier people gaunt, the fat burned away by cold, and worry the skin drawn tight across the bones of their faces. They looked like people who had survived something they were not yet sure they had survived, which was exactly what they were. Walter Haynes stood behind his counter. He was thinner than Clara remembered, with dark circles beneath his eyes that had not been there in August, and his beard, still trimmed close, had gone whiter at the edges. He looked like a man who had not slept well in a long time, and Clara suspected he looked that way because he had not. She waited until the crowd thinned. Then she approached. "I need wood," she said. Walter looked at her for a long moment. His hands were resting on the counter, and they did not move. His expression shifted through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and something like relief, and something else beneath both that Clara could not immediately name. "You are alive," he said. "Yes. I heard about Caldwell. He said you saved his life, said your cabin was warm enough to bring him back from the edge." Walter paused. "He said you lined your walls with sheep wool." "I did." Walter was quiet for a time that felt longer than it was. The store had gone still around them. 2 or 3 customers had stopped pretending to examine merchandise and were openly listening. In a town this small in a winter, this brutal news of survival was the only currency that still held its value. "The Hendrickson place," Walter said finally. 20 miles north of town. The family left in November, went back to Minnesota, could not take the cold. Their wood pile is still there. 3 cords, maybe 4. Nobody has claimed it because nobody has had the strength to haul it. Clara stared at him. "I cannot pay for 4 cords, I know." Walter removed his spectacles and polished them on his shirt. It was the same gesture Clara had seen in August, the habitual motion of a man buying time for his thoughts to arrange themselves. But the hands performing it were not the same hands. They were thinner, and they trembled slightly, and they handled the spectacles with a care that suggested the man behind them had recently learned something about fragility. "Consider it credit," he said. "You can pay me back in wool next fall. Market rate." Clara did not speak immediately. The offer made no sense against everything Walter had told her in August, the lecture about sheep people and credit risk and the foolishness of expecting something from nothing. She had replayed that conversation 100 times during the winter, and each time Walter's voice had been steady and certain and correct. "The math does not work. You will freeze. The ones who do not make it." "Why?" she said. Walter put his spectacles back on. He met her eyes directly, and what Clara saw there was not pity, and was not charity, and was not the condescension of a man helping someone beneath him. What she saw was something rarer and more difficult. Recognition. The look of a man seeing something he had believed was impossible standing in front of him with cracked boots and windburned skin, asking for wood to finish what everyone, including himself, had said could not be done. "Because I told you that you would freeze," Walter said. "And you did not." He paused. Because everyone I know with more money and more help and better odds is dead or ruined, and you are standing in my store asking for wood to finish the winter." He shook his head slowly. "I have been in this territory for 18 years. I have watched a great many people try to survive out here. Most of them fail. The ones who do not, they usually have money, or family, or luck. You had none of those things. You had sheep and stubbornness and an idea that should have killed you." Walter looked down at the counter. His voice dropped lower, and Clara understood that what came next was not meant for the people listening in the aisles. It was meant for her and perhaps for himself and perhaps for someone who was not in the room at all. "My son Walter," said Emmett, winter of '82, he was 19, "took a herding job 15 miles from town. I told him not to go. He went. January came. The storms came. He trailed off for a moment, and his hands stopped moving on the counter, and the store was absolutely silent. I found him in March," Walter said, "sitting against the wall of his cabin. The stove was cold. The wood was gone. He had been dead for weeks." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not diminish what Walter was telling her, so she gave him the only thing she could: silence and attention and the respect of not looking away. "When I said the ones who do not," Walter continued, his voice steady again, but carrying a weight it had not carried in August, "I was talking about my boy. Every time I said it to every herder who came through that door, every young person heading out to a line camp with not enough wood and not enough sense, I was talking about Emmett. He was the one who did not. And I have been waiting 5 years for someone to prove to me that it did not have to happen that way." He looked up. His eyes were clear and dry and very steady. "Maybe I was wrong," he said, "about what it takes to make it here. Emmett did not have a bad idea. He did not have any idea at all. He just had youth and confidence and no one to teach him what you knew. What your grandmother knew. That there was a way to fight the cold that did not require money or luck or a husband. Just knowledge and the willingness to use it." He straightened up behind the counter, and when he spoke again, his voice was the voice Clara remembered from August, practical and direct and free of sentiment. "The Hendrickson wood pile will not haul itself. I will send my man with a wagon tomorrow if the road is passable. 3 cords should see you through to spring with room to spare." Clara nodded. She opened her mouth to say thank you, but Walter raised a hand. "Do not thank me," he said. "Pay me back in wool. And next fall, when the new herders come through, you show them what you showed Caldwell: how to line the walls, how to use the fleece. You teach them what your grandmother taught you so that no one else sits against a wall in a cold cabin waiting for a spring that comes too late." She left the mercantile carrying the supplies she could not pay for, and a debt she'd intended to honor, and something else that had no price and no weight, but that she felt in her chest like the first warmth of a stove catching fire after a long night. She had been seen. Not pitied, not rescued. Seen. By a man who had spent 5 years looking at every young herder through the ghost of his dead son, and who had finally found one who did not fit the pattern. Not because she was stronger or luckier or better, because she had listened to an old woman's voice in a memory that smelled like lanolin, and she had acted on it when acting was all she had. Word spread faster than Clara could have imagined. In a territory that had just endured the worst winter in recorded history, where every ranch and every family and every business was taking stock of what had been lost, the story of the Norwegian woman who survived in a wool-lined cabin carried the specific gravity of hope. Hope was in short supply that February, and people traveled considerable distances to find it. By late February, 3 families had visited her cabin to see the insulation for themselves. By early March, 7 more had come. They pressed their hands against the walls, felt the greasy texture of the lanolin, coated fleece, asked questions about thickness and attachment and cost. The answers were simple enough to be almost laughable. 3.5 inches thick, nailed directly to the interior planks. Use unwashed fleece with the lanolin intact. Total cost 40 cents for materials if you did not have your own sheep. Nothing if you did. The solution to the problem that had been killing herders for decades had been sitting in burn piles on every sheep ranch in the territory, waiting to be recognized as the thing it always was. Not waste, not garbage. The difference between alive and dead, available for free to anyone willing to listen to an old woman's memory. Helen Mercer came in person on March 8th, accompanied by Robert. They walked through Clara's cabin, slowly examining every surface, pressing their hands against the walls, bending to inspect where the fleece met the floor, reaching up to feel the ceiling insulation. Robert Mercer was a large man, quiet by nature, with the calculating eyes of someone who had built a successful operation by seeing value where others saw cost. How much warmer, he asked. At 46 below outside the interior, held at 22 degrees with the stove burning low. At 63 below, it held at 9 degrees with the stove running constant. And the wood consumption, a fifth of a cord per week under normal conditions. More during the worst storms, but I survived November through February on 2 cords total. Robert looked at his wife. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that 20 years of partnership builds a language made not of words but of shared understanding. We have 14 line camps, Helen said. All of them board and batten, all of them cold. Every winter we lose herders, sometimes to the weather, sometimes because they leave before the weather can get them. And you have damaged fleece from shearing, Clara said. Belly wool, pegs, felted pieces, all the material your buyers reject. Hundreds of pounds of it, Robert said. We burn it every spring. Do not burn it, Clara said. Line your cabins. The Mercers returned to their ranch that afternoon. By April, crews were installing wool insulation in all 14 of their line camps. By the following winter, every major sheep operation in Major County had adopted the technique. The material that the entire territory had considered waste, the fleece too damaged and too dirty and too foul-smelling for any merchant to purchase, turned out to be the most effective cold-weather insulation available on the northern plains. And it had been there all along, piled in corners and burned in spring fires, waiting for someone to remember what a Norwegian grandmother had known her entire life. Garrett Dunning heard about it. The cattleman who had stood in front of the mercantile in October and predicted Clara's death with the confidence of a man who believed the future answered to him was still alive in April, but barely. He had lost 2,000 head in the Great Die-Up. Nearly 70% of his herd frozen on the open range where he had left them to fend for themselves, because that was how cattle ranching worked. You turned them loose on the grass and trusted the animals and the land and the system to do the rest. The system had failed. The land had turned against him. And the animals had died standing up in the snow. His operation would never recover. Within 2 years, he would sell his remaining cattle at a loss and leave Montana Territory for good, heading south to a warmer climate in a smaller life, and the knowledge that the empire he had spent 15 years building had been erased in a single winter. Clara saw him one more time in White Sulphur Springs in late March. She was collecting supplies for the spring lambing, walking out of the mercantile with a sack of flour over her shoulder, when she saw him standing outside the bank across the muddy street. He was thinner than she remembered. His broad shoulders had drawn inward, and his face the face that had radiated certainty and contempt. In October now wore the hollowed expression of a man watching his life's work disappear into a distance he could not follow. Their eyes met across the street. The mud between them was churned and brown with the first melt of spring, rutted with wagon tracks and pocked with horse prints, and the distance from the mercantile steps to the bank steps was perhaps 40 feet close enough to speak close enough to see every line and shadow on each other's faces. Dunning said nothing. Clara said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She had told him in October that she would see him in spring, and here they were both alive, standing on opposite sides of a street in a town that had been gutted by the winter he had been so certain would kill her. She had survived. He had survived. But everything he had owned was dead or dying, and everything she had built was still standing, and the 40 feet of mud between them might as well have been an ocean. Clara turned and walked up the street toward her horse. Behind her, Garrett Dunning turned and walked in the opposite direction. They never spoke again. Clara Whitfield stayed in Montana. She worked for the Mercers through the spring of 1887, tending her flock through lambing season, watching the new lambs arrive on legs too thin and too wobbly to support the lives they would eventually carry. Then she used her saved wages to purchase a small flock of her own, 120 head, bought sheep from a cattleman who was liquidating everything he owned to pay debts he had not imagined possible a year earlier. She filed a homestead claim on 160 acres along the Musselshell River. She built a proper cabin on that claim, larger than the shack she had survived the winter in, with wool-insulated walls from the foundation up, designed from the first board to hold heat the way her grandmother's farmhouse had held it in Norway. She married James Caldwell in the fall of 1888. He had rebuilt his own operation using wool insulation in every structure and had become one of the most successful small operators in the Judith Basin. Together, they ran a combined flock of over 1,000 head. They had 4 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, a record remarkable enough on the frontier that it deserves its own sentence. She died in 1930 at the age of 67 in the cabin she had built on the land she had proved up. Her children found her in the morning, sitting in her chair by the stove, as if she had simply fallen asleep and decided not to return. The stove was warm. The wool in the walls was still intact. When her grandchildren dismantled the cabin in 1952, they found the fleece compressed but undamaged beneath the interior paneling that had been added years after the original construction. The lanolin was still faintly present in the fibers. 65 years after Clara had nailed it to the walls of a shack on the Musselshell River, the wool was still doing its job. In the winter of 1886 to 1887, the temperature in central Montana Territory dropped to 63 degrees below zero. 16 inches of snow fell in 16 hours. The wind drove ice crystals through every gap in every wall built by conventional means. The cattle industry of the northern plains collapsed. Ranches failed. Men who had called themselves kings discovered they were subjects of a cold they could not buy or bully or negotiate their way past. Walter Haynes, the merchant of White Sulphur Springs, had looked at a 23-year-old Norwegian woman with $7 to her name and told her plainly, "The ones who make it have help. The ones who do not." He had not finished the sentence. He had been talking about his own son. He had been carrying that unfinished sentence for 5 years, and he would carry it for the rest of his life. But after the winter of 1887, it meant something different to him than it had before. Because in a 12 by 14 cabin on the Musselshell River lined with 63 pounds of raw sheep's wool that every merchant and every rancher and every self-appointed expert in the territory had called waste, a woman who had never insulated a wall in her life held the killing cold to 9 degrees above zero. She saved a man who walked 6 miles through the worst blizzard in Montana history. She kept 225 sheep alive, while 60% of the cattle in the Judith Basin died where they stood. She survived with 2 cords of wood when the men who knew said she needed 7. She survived alone when the men who knew said she needed a husband. She survived with garbage when the men who knew said she needed money. Clara Whitfield did not have help. She did not have family. She did not have luck. She did not have any of the things that Walter Haynes had spent 18 years believing were necessary for survival in Montana Territory. She had wool. She had the memory of a grandmother who understood that warmth was not something you purchased, but something you built from what the world gave you for free. And she had the one thing that no mercantile stocked and no catalog sold and no amount of money could guarantee: the refusal to sit down at the table and stop. When the spring of 1887 finally came to the Musselshell Valley, when the snow pulled back from the hills and the river broke free of its ice, and the first green pushed up through the mud, Clara Whitfield was still there to see it.